I'm Alexandra Ministern. I'm the new Dean of Humanities. I arrived here in the fall, and I'm delighted to be at UCLA. I moved here from the University of Michigan. This is a wonderful moment of the final of the series of the Possible Worlds Lecture. I feel fortunate that I am able to introduce this final lecture, which represents a partnership between UCLA and the Berggruen Institute, specific around issues of humanities and pressing humanistic questions in the 21st century in particular. This event, and in fact our partnership, really looks at questions about the future of humanity, bringing in innovative speakers and thought leaders, people whose ideas help shape our world, shape some of the most pressing questions that we're dealing with today. Previous speakers include political theorist Danielle Allen, architect Alejandro Aravena, author Kim Stanley Robinson, whose novels are relevant to this discussion today as well, Director General Darja Isaacson, and economist Gabrielle Zuckman. Professor Robyn Eckersley is going to present. After her presentation, we will welcome Professor Alex Hall to moderate an interview and conversation with Robyn. Alex Hall, we share the same first name, so I feel like you're already my friend. Yes, it's a great unisex name, right? Is a professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences. He is also the director of the UCLA Center for Climate Science and interim director, because he's not busy enough, of the UCLA Sustainability LA Grand Challenge. One of the really nice things about this event is that we will have time for questions from the audience, some questions submitted online, and so this really can be kind of more of a conversation moderated by Alex. I am now going to turn it over to Dawn Nakagawa, who is the Executive Vice President of the Berggruen Institute, and she is going to introduce Professor Eckersley. And let me just say before I hand it over that thank you to all the staff who put energy and effort into organizing this event, Lauren, Sarah, and others who I'm not even quite sure who was behind the scenes, but thank you for being behind the scenes and setting everything up for us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dawn.
All right, thank you, Dean Stern, and thank you all for being here. I'm Dawn Nakagawa from the Berggruen Institute. I'm the Executive Vice President there and the Director of the Future of Democracy program, so this topic is of great interest to me tonight. The Berggruen Institute, our mission is really to create and develop new ideas that on which to build social and political institutions. We are driven by the belief that the institutions, the institutional architecture we have today mostly keeps us blind to the way the world actually is, as opposed and tells us instead narratives that as we would wish them to be. And what I mean by that is essentially we're creating, these narratives were created to protect paradigms of power, historical paradigms of power that protected certain people over others. And we're in a moment right now where we're seeing massive upheaval and massive change, which is a great opportunity space for us to be operating in. We do this work by being pretty much irreverent towards disciplines and very suspicious of our current ontologies, and trying to mix things up and bring lots of different people into conversations about fundamental principles and what our values should be and what do we mean when we say and how do we get to the places we want to be in terms of creating a good society and what ideas should we be building those new institutions on. The twin conspirators with us in this work are climate change and exponential tech, both of which challenge all of our institutions and I think unveil their inadequacies, both in terms of managing the challenges, but also taking advantage of the opportunity spaces that are available to us. And so we use those two, technology and climate change, a lot in our work because they are so helpful in helping us, think through fundamentally the level of change that we need to make and how to re-envision institutions that are capable of managing those challenges and taking advantage of those opportunities. So tonight we're very lucky to have Robyn Eckersley with us, and she will be talking about the relationship between climate change and one of my favorite institutions, democracy. Robyn Eckersley, and I'm going to read this so I don't get it wrong, is the Redmond Berry Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Melbourne and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. She's received the Distinguished Scholar Award for the Environmental Studies at the International Studies Association Annual Convention in Toronto in 2019. She's widely published in environmental political theory, international relations, with a particular focus on ecological democracy. And as I said, this evening's lecture will be about the relationship between democracy and climate change, and specifically whether climate change will be the cause for our democratic demise or actually be its savior. So with that, I will hand it over to Robyn Eckersley, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Well, first, thank you very much for the very warm welcome to Dean Alex Stern, the UCLA Humanities Division, and the warm welcome also from you, Dawn, from the Berggruen Institute. This is my first time on the campus of UCLA, and it's quite something to behold, particularly when the sun finally came out today. So today I'm going to talk to you about the climate emergency movement and the future of democracy. And you might wonder, why the future of democracy? Because democracy is in such a bad shape now, right? And that's certainly true. But I want to bring the emergency movement and the future of democracy together in a particular way because it's kind of a keyhole into a larger debate about temporal politics, how we deal with the kind of ticking clock when it comes to climate change. I'm looking at the democratic challenge of trying to mobilise citizens and then states to actually radically ramp up and dramatically increase their mitigation ambition. Not by 2050, that's way too far away, but in this decade and the next. And we've just heard from the World Meteorological Organization just last week, there's a very, very high chance that we will hit 1.5 degrees temporarily within the next 5 years, in at least 1 year in the next 5 years. That won't be a permanent condition, but we will start to get more of a foretaste of what 1.5 degrees might mean, and that's the lower threshold in the temperature targets for the Paris Agreement. So I'm looking at the climate emergency movement because it's making a particular claim that global heating is an overriding and existential threat to human civilization and life on Earth as we know it, that we therefore have to suspend normal politics and business as usual and pursue aggressive action on a scale of a wartime mobilisation. And we must do this because time is of the essence. And if we fail, then we are at a very high risk of socio-ecological collapse. Now you might notice that in that claim, there's all the elements of the grammar of emergency politics. And while this has mobilised many, it's also caused disquiet among others. But let's first just introduce the climate emergency movement before we look at its critics and also whether it's a potential saviour. This movement is a child of the new millennium. It is born out of frustration with the fact that after 30 years or 3 decades, it feels like 30 decades, I've been following it that long, we have not actually got to reduce global emissions. They're actually still rising despite 3 climate treaties, the most recent being the Paris Agreement. So this movement is reaching for the word emergency, not crisis. Why not crisis? Well, crisis, you can have an acute crisis, but you can have a chronic crisis. They're reaching for the word emergency because emergency means time is of the essence. We all know what it's like in a medical emergency or when there's a flood or a fire. You have to give it absolute priority. You have to make swift action. And if you don't, then something really bad will happen. So that's the nature, that's the political appeal of the emergency frame rather than a crisis frame, although you often hear them used interchangeably. Now, the idea of pursuing climate change like a wartime mobilisation, I think was first mentioned by Lester Brown from the World Watch Institute back in the early 2000s, about 2003. But the actual appearance of a climate emergency movement happened first in my own city of Melbourne, in a municipality called the City of Darebin. And this was in December 2016, 1 year after the Paris Agreement. And since then, and particularly since the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees, requested by the most vulnerable countries, that was released in 2018, it's really started to grow around the world, but it's a particularly strong phenomenon in the Anglosphere. I'll talk about why that might be the case a little later. It's been picked up by the school strikes, by Greta Thunberg, by Extinction Rebellion. It's clearly a transnational movement. It's grown and taken off. It's been embraced by the UN Environment Programme, by the UN Secretary General. Even the Said Business School at Oxford University now runs an online course called the Oxford Climate Emergency Programme. In 2019, it was the Oxford Word of the Year. Indeed, the frame has now become so ubiquitous that some of the early activists are now saying it's being greenwashed. So what I want to do in the time left is offer a sympathetic critique of this movement. It's such an interesting movement because it raises so many awkward and difficult challenges. I'll then turn it around and ask a question that the critics have not asked. What will happen if the climate emergency demands on the state are not met and we actually move into a hothouse world? What will happen to democracy? Okay, so let's start with its critics. I single out 4 main criticisms of this movement. The first one is that it poses the risk of ushering in a permanent, or legitimating a permanent state of emergency and the rise of authoritarian rule to tackle climate change. And there's a very long debate about the lure of authoritarianism, and there's an eco-authoritarian strand that's been around ever since the first limit to growth debate. The second criticism is that the climate emergency movement, in prioritising science, is likely to usher in a kind of climate epistocracy, a rule by climate experts, if the fantasy was realised. And this would squeeze out other voices, other forms of knowledge. So this is an argument about democratic exclusion and voice. The third argument is it focuses on the time-critical nature of the challenge of global heating, is that the movement gives priority to climate protection over climate justice. So this is also a claim about democratic inclusion and voice, or exclusion in this instance. And finally, in necessarily playing on fear of some kind of climate apocalypse, this is not a very productive way of mobilising, or so it is argued. So this is about different political strategies for democratic mobilisation. So they're the 4 criticisms. So I'm briefly going to delve into those a little bit more, because they're not quite what they seem. In many but not all cases, the criticisms do not actually hit the target because they're not empirically informed. Because what you see in both climate emergency claim making and critics of that claim making are a mixture of normative claims and empirical claims, and also imaginaries of the future and speculations about the future. So it's very difficult to actually disentangle them. So let's start with the first round of criticism. Perhaps the most significant exponent would be Mike Hume from Cambridge University. He's argued that both emergency discourses and also emergency powers can legitimate absolute either technocracy, which kind of bleeds into the second argument, or a kind of Chinese-style command and control climate governance. He also says the discourses narrow the policy goals so that hitting the carbon numbers becomes all that matters. He even has issues with the idea of climate deadlines because they're dangerous. They can justify quasi-emergency rule, at least for so long as they're not met. Now, the problem with this criticism is it seems to fail to notice that these claims are overwhelmingly made by civil society, not the state. So these are not claims made by the state against civil society to undermine democratic rights. They're claims made by youth and diverse social movements against the state to get on with the job of climate action. So they should be understood relationally. Why have they emerged now in the new millennium? Because we've been working on this for a very, very long time and have not got very far, given the size of the problem. And if you look at the proliferation of climate emergency claims, they've occurred mostly at the subnational level. In fact, as of April, just last month, there have been 2,327 emergency declarations made by governments around the world, and in 40 countries. And the overwhelming majority of those are at the municipal level. Only 19 of those have been made at the national level. So unlike the COVID emergency declarations, which did justify autocratic rule, particularly in Hungary and also Poland, the empirical research here hasn't found any drift towards authoritarianism. They're not exactly a resounding success either, but some studies show there is an increase in climate action and policy and movement in some jurisdictions. Now, this is not to deny that emergency claim making and particularly emergency powers can't be abused. Of course they can. We have a very sorry history we can point to there. I can imagine how they might be used to legitimate risky geoengineering technologies, but I won't go into that now. But the point I'm trying to make is that climate emergency claim making and even climate emergency politics is not necessarily always democratic. So that's the key point. If the push comes from citizens, if they do galvanise significant support, if it remains within the rule of law, with the normal systems of transparency, accountability and revisability, I cannot see a risk here to democratic politics. There's a lot of ifs there though, and the potential to go wrong is of course very real. So let's turn to the next criticism. Are we looking at a future climate epistocracy? Because, like it or not, states are going to become climate states, either because they've avoided it and they're overwhelmed by the problem, or because it has to become an overriding challenge, an overriding priority in order to prevent such an outcome. The argument here is by insisting that governments must listen to the science, that the climate emergency movement is discounting, ignoring, or neglecting, or marginalising other forms of knowledge. If we take, for example, one article by Zulianello and Cecciobelli, they've claimed that Greta Thunberg is a technocentric ecocentric who wants vox scientifica to prevail over vox populi, as if this is not the voice of youth. So there's something kind of weird in the criticism. They're criticisms that spin out and don't quite capture what's happening on the ground. Now, there's no doubt that the climate emergency movement draws heavily on climate science, without which it would not exist, because we may be experiencing more weird weather, but we wouldn't understand why. The science is explaining why. And science, by virtue of its method of inquiry, delivers what Sheila Jasanoff so eloquently says are serviceable truths that we ignore at our peril. So this criticism only has force if the climate emergency movement is only admitting climate science into the policy-making circle. Because if that were the case, this would definitely be a problem for democracy and also for an effective climate response, because the more knowledges we draw upon, not just the STEM areas of research, but social sciences, humanities, indigenous knowledge, vernacular knowledge, lived experience of those who work the land, the more knowledge is the better, because we need critical conversations to solve such a wicked problem. And ruling that out means we don't have those critical conversations, that we have policies that don't work, that lack political legitimacy. And climate scientists can't tell us what policy is going to be politically legitimate or not. And finally, and there's so much more I can say about this, particularly about the role of expert committees, but perhaps we can discuss that in the Q&A. But the other way in which this criticism misfires is that what's driving the climate emergency movement is not just what they hear from the science, but their experience of real climate emergencies and their future imaginary of an avalanche of climate emergencies where it becomes a general condition. So it's that it's climate imaginaries which go well beyond science that are really driving this particular movement. So let's now turn to the third criticism, that the movement seeks climate protection to prevail over climate justice. Allied to this is the claim that it's mostly a white middle-class movement in the global north. And I'll deal with each of these in turn. The first criticism I think is very important and must be taken seriously, but we must not think about climate protection and climate justice as conceptually distinct and unrelated. They're actually mutually dependent on each other. For example, for younger generations, what they're seeking, amongst other things, is intergenerational climate justice. And for the most vulnerable countries in the world, what they're wanting is international justice now and in the future. Of the 19 national emergency declarations that we've seen, 3 are from highly vulnerable states, from Bangladesh, Peru, the Maldives and Vanuatu. There's also a new forum called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It's called the V20, but there are now some 48 states representing some 1.2 billion people who make emergency claims. In fact, at the Glasgow Climate Summit in 2021, the Climate Vulnerable Forum was pushed for a climate, its sort of manifesto that it produced for that particular COP called for a climate emergency pact. So this is not claim making that's unique to the global north. Of course, to the extent to which the climate emergency movement lacks diversity, I think that's a problem because it will limit its resonance and the diversity of experiences in the movement in terms of building political legitimacy. But the broader point here is that if we think of climate justice as multidimensional in terms of the concept of justice is really blown out in all sorts of interesting ways to include recognition, distributive consequences, to include participation, and of course reparations as well. These are all different dimensions of climate justice. So what we have here is a rather troubling set of inter-climate justice tensions between perhaps intergenerational justice on the one hand and spatial injustice at the moment in different countries, internationally and so forth. We'll see some new injustices from the renewable energy revolution with the sacrifice zones in lithium mines and so forth. So there's so many dimensions here that we need to keep all of them in view and to recognise some of the very real tensions. If you take the just transition movement, they're seeking not just justness, but timeliness, effectiveness, and so forth. And all these things are very difficult to bring together all at once. And so sometimes strategic decisions have to be made. So I take this as a serious criticism, but I do think that what it does, it takes us to, in terms of the critique of if it actually holds, and some of this varies, where you bring this criticism down to ground empirically, in particular regions of the world, it might come up differently in terms of whether it actually hits a target or not. But what it brings us to, and this is my final point, is the democratic resonance challenge of climate emergency claim making. Now, this argument essentially says that fear is not a very productive way of mobilising political action, that this idea of a climate apocalypse can produce anxiety and guilt. It can activate a defensive posture of denial and generate messaging fatigue and desensitisation, the so-called climate porn argument. More sympathetic critiques say that it's going to have diminishing returns, and I actually agree with that. It does have a use-by date, and I'll get to that shortly. Meanwhile, there's technocentric eco-botanists like Michael Schellenberger who say there's nothing to fear because there will never be an apocalypse. He's got a book called Apocalypse Never. So there's critics from within and outside the movement here about the use of fear. But again, when you start to study this empirically and adopt a more ethnographic frame of mind, you'll find that it actually does have some resonance. But it does demand that if it's going to build legitimacy, it must be able to hold out hope that human agency can make a difference and that there's some measure of human collective solidarity. Otherwise, without hope and without a sense of agency, we just have despair and disillusionment. So, a study of the Greta Thunberg effect in the US, which is quite an interesting study, said that those exposed to her speeches emerged with a stronger sense of collective efficacy and an intention to work collectively with others to tackle global heating. And this was similar not just amongst adolescents, but also all age groups, which I found actually quite surprising. Louise Snops has done some interesting work also on the role of affect and time in the Fridays for Future movement, and has looked at how it's created a kind of terrestrial affective identity, which is incredibly mobilising for these students. So again, the evidence is really mixed here, and I can see why those criticisms might work for some audiences in some contexts, but not for all. And so this is why we need to really get down in the weeds and see how this works for different audiences. So to start moving towards the finish line here, let's now get down in the weeds a bit more and look more closely at the discursive structure of climate emergency claim making, because when you do that, you find it actually departs in two significant respects from what might be called the normal grammar of emergency claim making. The first is the construction of equivalence between now and the future. How's this done? It's done by working from everyone's experience of real emergencies, of floods and fires and droughts and terrible storms, to a generalised condition or to an imaginary of the future of an avalanche of these climate emergencies where we are living in a general condition of emergency. And that this imaginary can only be addressed if we act as if it were happening now. So there's a sleight of hand here in the discourse. Take Greta Thunberg's famous speech at Davos, the World Economic Forum in 2019, where she says, "I am here to say our house is on fire." And she closes with, "I don't want your hope. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day." And that fear is the climate imaginary she holds of the future. That's not normally how climate emergency discourses work. The second one is moving from emergency as reaction. We typically think of emergency as something sudden that happens that seriously disrupts normality. And if swift action, typically by professionals who are trained to deal in emergencies and barely have to think, they go into motion, have to respond, and if they don't within a very narrow window of time, then there'll be some grave consequence. Well, this is clearly not sudden. This is something that's been brewing and happening for a long time. We've heard the warnings for ages. The evidence is starting to appear more routinely before our eyes. And so this is not emergency as reaction and getting back to normal. It's emergency as a kind of anticipation and proaction to try and find a new normal that doesn't generate this problem. It's a bit vague about exactly what that is, and we can debate about that. It clearly doesn't like neoliberalism, but there's not a lot there, and that again is a challenge for the movement. But just to quote the radicalised environmental lawyer, Farhana Yamin, who played a big role at Paris and Paris negotiations in giving voice to all climate movements, she said, and I quote, "Normal politics has failed us. It has brought the whole planet to the brink of ecological disaster." So she glued herself outside the stock exchange in the city of London to the anguish of her kids and husband, who had no idea she was going to do this. So on the one hand, there would seem to be a very specific temporal frame to climate emergency claim making, which roughly corresponds to the critical window of time that's defined in the discourse, typically a decade and a bit. Because once this closes, there isn't any hope of any real efficacy unless the discourse can morph to generate new hope, or just say, well, you can still make things less bad, or some kind of discursive turn. But the discourse as it holds at the moment can't do that. On the other hand, though, as this window closes, and we increasingly experience more and more real climate emergencies, I would expect to see more political galvanisation, but less opportunity to actually make the sort of difference that is hoped by the climate emergency movement now. So in the few minutes remaining, I'm going to change tack here and give you an unravelling of democracy, and it's a logic that fits within. It's implicit, it's buried in the logic of climate emergency claim making. It's a story, and I'm drawing on my own knowledge of state and democracy, something I've studied for a very long time. It's a democratic unravelling that erupts initially through a fiscal crisis of states in the global north and the global south, but I'm focusing on the global north here. It begins with the gradual shrinking and disappearance of the market for insurance and reinsurance, so that when these losses continue to mount up, those who suffer have nowhere to turn but the state or charity. At present, these growing damage costs are not factored in budget forecasts because governments don't want to know, and also because these damages are incalculable, have the quality of what Ulrich Beck called the world risk unknowable, incalculable, uninsurable. Alongside these damage claims, we'll see the state confronted with many, many more claims for government services, repair to infrastructure, social security, health expenditure, emergency services expenditure. The list would go on. As we've seen with COVID, disruption to supply chains, which will most definitely increasingly happen with real climate emergencies, will lead to shortages and inflation. Most disturbingly, agriculture will be hit the hardest with floods, fires, droughts, coastal inundation, and so forth. So there'll be food shortages, and food prices will rise faster than other prices. And there'll also be a greater demand for land for carbon capture and storage, for bioenergy and carbon capture sequestration, or BECCS as it's called. Increasing inflation will erode consumer spending power. Firms will face a declining profitability from falling demand and from damage to public and private infrastructure, and also due to rising supply chain disruption and rising costs. The net effect will be a gradual but increasingly dramatic reduction in government revenue at the same time as increasing demands upon the state, increasing legitimation crises on the state, both accumulation crises and legitimation crises, to put it in neo-Marxist theories, crisis theories of the state language. It will be less able to make the sorts of transfer payments through the taxation system to deal with rapidly growing inequality within states, and we're going to see that, of course, between states as well. To survive, political parties and political elites will have to find supplementary forms of income. So they'll turn, so this will, other sources of finance, so they'll have to turn, the propensity for corruption and cronyism will only grow. The political effects of all of this will give rise to increasing social unrest and riot and so forth. So of course you can see where this is going. Emergency rule will start to become increasingly frequent and possibly become the durable form of government, and we can say goodbye to liberal democracy. We can expect rising nationalism, ethno-nationalism, scapegoating, ethnic minorities, resource nationalism, mercantilism, trade wars, and increasing financial instability. Of course, the much needed climate finance that developing countries desperately need will dry up. So states will become increasingly dysfunctional. And those states that remain quasi-functional, they will be legitimated by ethno-nationalism, not democracy. So this is obviously a convenience scenario, but it's deliberately chosen as one that I see as implicit inside emergency claim making. It's trying to draw out the apocalyptic imaginary, at least the democratic dimensions of that. This is what makes Greta Thunberg panic, you might say. So to conclude, and I think I've used all my time here, I think it's true that there are risks to democracy of the climate emergency movement, but I've tried to suggest that we shouldn't have a knee-jerk reaction to climate emergency claim making, because it need not necessarily be democratic. So we might understand climate emergency claim making as trying to make use of the very poor democratic institutions that we have to make the future a governable object. That's what they're trying to do, to make the future become something that can, before it becomes something that can no longer be either democratically governed or governed at all. There's so much more I could say about climate change and democracy, but I think I've run out of time and we can save that for the discussion. Thanks very much.
I will just take moderator's prerogative here and just start out. You know, it does, thinking back on my own history as a climate scientist, the predictions that we were making back in the 90s when I joined the field were what's happening now. And so those weren't imaginings, those were theorizing, of course, but based on what we understood to be the physical laws of the climate system. So it feels very appropriate to this rhetorical sleight of hand that you mentioned, where the future emergencies are conflated with the idea of a present emergency, feels very true and right. How do you think about these kind of time lags? The decisions we're making now are affecting the emergencies we will have, and the emergencies that we have now are actually the result of decisions we made long ago. And really, we should have a time machine where we can go back and and treat the emergency when it actually occurred. But so it's like an emergency squared or something. How do you think about this time lag issue?
Well, Alex, you've put your finger right on the challenge.
I think your mic might not.
Oops, sorry. Where's the button? Oh, is that it there?
There we go. You're on. You're good.
Testing, testing.
Yep.
Yes. You've put your finger right on the nub of the problem, the time lag. And the problem is climate emergency claim making does not resonate with many people now, because in between emergencies that they may have experienced or observed, things kind of feel more or less normal. You know, today is a normal day, right? What's this fear mongering? And I think that's the problem. Not everyone feels that panic. Not everyone has that reaction. And I'm reminded of a book by Kari Norgaard, she's Norwegian, called Climate Denial. She said it's actually very difficult for we humans to confront climate change. It's much easier to live in denial, not in the way that professional climate deniers do, but just to get by on a daily basis, to go about our lives. We can't hold that in our head all day. We'll become dysfunctional. We have to push it out to function. And so this, I think, is the democratic challenge. So my lecture is in many ways a plea to think about how one might enable us to still be functioning human beings on a daily basis, but also keep this in view and mobilise around it in a way. I probably hinted at the idea that it's not enough to have a movement to stop bad stuff happening. You actually need to start creating some positive vision of what that might be. And thinking more along those lines, I think, might be more productive. It could draw people in. But of course, that's a critical conversation. It's going to land in different places with different conversations. But I think that's exactly the problem. And it resonates with some and it doesn't resonate with others for very obvious reasons, really. But we need to understand that. Because otherwise, if there's a huge mismatch between the climate apocalypse we're creating and also the policy measures that we're doing. I mean, I remember when I watched Inconvenient Truth, I was kind of blown away. Then I got to the end and there was the credits and they said, write to your congressperson. I went, what? You've just shown me this and you think a letter? You know, this is it's just out of proportion. I either don't believe you or what you're suggesting I do is totally wrong. So there needs to be a calibration with what we can do commensurate to the way we portray the problem.
Yeah. So I guess I'll turn to the audience and see if there are any questions. Yes, Ursula.
Yeah, thank you for this really instructive talk. I'm going to teach my cues while we disagree about climate change in a couple of chapters tomorrow. So I'm interested in your mentioning him and his critique of the apocalyptic discourse around climate change. But I think sort of one question that always haunts me a little bit in discussions sort of in the American left about these issues is that there's one strand of environmentalism that says that you cannot solve the climate crisis politically without solving it economically. And the most extreme stance in that camp would say, you know, a la Jason Moore or Slavoj Žižek, we have to get, or Naomi Klein for that matter, we have to actually get rid of capitalism. Now, none of these people have presented the slightest outline of a hint of an idea of what this alternative economic order would look like. I mean, for Naomi Klein, it seems to be places in Germany and Denmark, which last time I looked were still fully capitalist, even though a different kind of capitalism than the Anglo-Saxon one. But I do wonder about the ways in which you see democracy and democratic decision making as being constrained by the requirements of capitalism, and certainly in the U.S., but maybe also in a very different way in China.
And I forgot to mention I've been asked to repeat the questions for the sake of the audience who's online. But yeah, I think the question was about the relationship between democracy and capitalism, and whether and how you're thinking about the economic dimensions of climate emergencies.
Well, certainly a post-capitalist world will be a much better one for dealing with the broader ecological crisis, not just climate change. But again, if you're thinking about the temporal challenge, that ain't going to happen in the next decade. And those that make that argument, and I'm very sympathetic towards it, need to be able to say, how does one build legitimacy for a different economic order? For me, that's the question. It's not so much what that order is, we need to start throwing out that debate. What is it about our current international order, which is quasi-liberal? Why is it generating this problem? And why is no one looking there? That's a good question. We need the conversation, but whatever we do, we have to build legitimacy for it. I see no other way. And I think we can move away from the neoliberal international order to perhaps back towards some more embedded order, but the only institution in the world that can discipline capitalism and transform it in ways that are consonant with preventing global heating and other ecological problems is the state. We can't do this behind the back of the state. And I can't see that how it can't happen without a strong welfare state, a social welfare state that's also green, a green social welfare state. That is the thing that will be able to do that, because capitalism, there's a mutual dependency between states and capitalism. States are fiscally parasitic on economic growth. Capitalists are dependent upon the law of contract, the rule of law, the regulation they need to have the certainty to invest. There's absolute close arrangement. So this legitimation accumulation crisis is something that that's the framework I use. But there's a whole body of work that's looking at this that says when states can no longer provide to the citizens the most basic things that are in the most implicit contract between citizen and state, which is protect me from danger, when they can't even do that, when climate change is affecting the life world to such an extent that everyone's suffering this kind of deep ontological insecurity, we're going to have some great debates about a different economic order right there. And so some say we can't break that sort of that dynamic until things get too bad. This kind of it's going to be too late argument. But I'll just throw in, there is another group of ecological thinkers called collapsologists or deep adapters who say it has to collapse, and they defy Jameson's famous quip that we'll see the end of the world before we see the end of capitalism. They say, oh no, we will see, let it crumble, let the order crash, let the apocalypse come, because that's the only way we're going to kill this dragon, and from that can arise these eco-communities that are democratic and so forth. I'm afraid I don't buy that, because I can't imagine how something as harmonious as an eco-community that's democratic could arise from those kind of ashes. But so that actually defies the whole climate emergency claim that the apocalypse is something we should stop. It's something we should bring on. It's a very Marxist idea, really. But yeah, I will put my faith in...
I mean, I don't understand how the state is able to control capitalism. I mean, isn't what we're seeing precisely showing that states can't control capitalism because capital can just move somewhere else?
Well, historically, the state created capitalism. The joint stock company...
company that isn't
yeah.
happening. I mean, that's happened in Germany, other places. You know, Nokia, the phone company, isn't happy with the environmental conditions that the state of Germany imposes on them. They just go to Romania, or they go somewhere else. In Romania, if it imposes EU regulations, they go to Vietnam, right? I mean, isn't that
Well, yes. I mean, so what you're pointing to there is the nature of the international order, which has a range of treaties that uphold those rights of capitalists, of corporations. It's not impossible for the states to gradually transform that international order. The most vulnerable countries in the climate negotiations are asking first for a transformation of the international financial order, the development banks, World Bank, IMF and so forth. They've got a whole lot of great ideas. They're in circulation. The same can happen to the World Trade Organization, the Global Rule Book for Global Commerce, which has sustainability in the preamble, and that's it. You recreate that as a fair and sustainable trade organization, things will start to change. So it's through these institutions. I mean, these are deep. Climate injustice is a structural injustice. We change the structures, we get rid of the structural injustices. So no state can do this individually. This requires international cooperation. And there's a movement now to green world trade. There's a push to change the nature of our international financial institutions. That's where the change happens, but you need a critical mass of states wanting that. You may not get unanimity, but you can build coalitions of the willing and build new institutions in regions, for example. And that's the only way I can see this practically happening as a political scientist.
Other questions? While people are thinking, I'll ask a quick follow-up. I've been thinking as you were talking about the world outside the progressive left, you know, there's a probably a majority of people who wouldn't identify that way, and a subset of them either don't value democracy or are indifferent to democracy's future. They also don't care about sustainability of the environment. We probably need to peel off a few of those people to build democratic legitimacy. So is the climate emergency framing the right way to talk to the people outside, you know, those who are debating about capitalism and democracy and sustainability, the progressive left?
I don't think it resonates enough. I think a crisis framework might work better, depending on how you frame it and what is actually in crisis, because a crisis can be chronic, and it can be generated by the political and economic systems that we consider normal. And so recognising that the problems that are looming up, and this includes not just climate change, but growing inequality and a range of other connected problems, then that forces critical attention on those very systems. As Beck says, they're systems of organised irresponsibility. We need to make them responsible. And so, and there's no critical window there, because a chronic crisis can limp along for a long time, but we can recognise it not going away because it's systemically generated. So then you can get much broader political conversations about other problems that are systemically generated. And if we can show that your problem that's systemically generated is also systemically generates our problem. So if we can change the system in this way, we might be able to deal with your problem and mine at once. So here's a vision where we might have, here's a bold idea, transform the corporation's governance structure. So it's not just directors having a fiduciary duty to shareholders, but also to employees, to the communities in which they operate. And the governing model has to have all of those having a voice in that operation, for example. So I think that way you're looking at some systemic structure and starting to say, well, the governance model is not working for it. Or for differently situated groups with differently situated problems, where the one solution can solve both of those.
Yeah. Yes, we'll go over to this thing here.
Yeah, hi. So you talking about changing structures and systems and corporations, and I'm curious if you think that the kind of growing labor movement can have a role in pushing corporations and changing these structures to be more climate friendly, and if so, how?
Well, sadly, it's the shrinking labour. Oh, sorry, you wanted.
Yeah, the question was about the labor movement and its role in making change here in this context.
Sure. Well, you mentioned the growing labour movement. It's actually a shrinking labour movement, shrinking union movement. This is a long-term trend, which helps to explain where we are now. It's why we've moved from embedded liberalism to neoliberalism. But neoliberalism, of course, is not in fashion anymore. COVID, it went out the window during COVID, and things haven't been quite the same since. So that is a critical juncture that can be exploited. Obviously, unions, I'm a strong believer in unions, but the technological displacement of labour has meant that labour as we once traditionally understood it is being transformed in all sorts of ways. So ways of scooping up workers of different kinds and bringing them together is a much harder job, but I think it's a job that should be done. Workers not necessarily in the same industry, but who would nonetheless have very similar interests, like those in the gig economy, for example. So, but clearly a broad-based mobilisation will change this, because Antonio Gramsci had it right. We can have agreement about our sources of disaffection, but if we cannot mobilise around something we all agree needs happening, the status quo will prevail.
I think there was a question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Tad Daly's my name. I'm a UCLA PhD alum, and I'm with an NGO called Citizens for Global Solutions today. Professor Eckersley, I think I heard you use the term terrestrial identity. And I want to drill down on that a little bit. Let me say three things. One, I love it. It's a great term. I'll give you a footnote if I use it somewhere. Two, it's great to hear if what I heard you say is that many of Greta's legions get a sense of terrestrial identity. But the problem, it seems to me, is that there is no terrestrial government. There are no terrestrial institutions. Greta gets her legions all fired up, but then government of Brazil, or the government of Bulgaria, or the government of Japan. As you said, at the end of Incometer, send a letter to your legislator. And that seems to me an incredibly frustrating reality. You know, what can we do to mobilize and utilize this terrestrial identity when, as Dawn from Berggruen will appreciate, there's nothing like terrestrial institutions to reflect those.
Sure. It was actually not me, it was Louise Knops, Knops, who did this study of the entanglement of affect and identity amongst school strikers. I prefer the term geopolitan democracy, because we think about cosmopolitan democracy as distinct from national democracy. By geopolitan, I mean, you know, we're in the Anthropocene, right? We've unwittingly become earth-shaping forces, and we know not what we do. We wouldn't have planned this mess, but it's crept up behind us as a side effects of all the things we do that are actually normal, right? Again, Ulrich Beck kind of language. A geopolitan imaginary is one that actually sees us as citizens of this earth, not just, it doesn't obliterate other identities, but it's a layer of our identity. And we act as citizens under that kind of imaginary rather than just my backyard or my nation. Cosmopolitan democracy was very big in the 90s, the kind of golden decade of globalization, but all of that's gone out the window and nationalism is on the rise. But a geopolitan identity is one that basically understands our ecological embodiment and embeddedness, and that it's the condition of our being, of our collective being, and our individual well-being. So it's kind of, you know, something that we've just only realized, oh my goodness, I have a body, oh my goodness, I have material needs, things come from somewhere, they go somewhere. So much of political theory in the humanities has not been really attentive to this until quite recently. And so it's a wonderful new flourishing of ecological humanities now, which is a joy to behold. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think many of us do have that affective identity. Not with Earth systems as abstract process, but often more with particular places. But as soon as you generalise from that, then you start to develop that broader affinity. And I think this is what mobilises many people in the broader environment movement. And it's a necessary thing. But not everyone has that, because most people don't really get to live in a way where they're cognizant that everything comes from somewhere and has to go somewhere.
I mean, we have global institutions that are weak, and I would say they're more technocratic than democratic. You talked a little bit about some new global institution building. Is that, I mean, how can we make that more democratic?
Well, I'm a bit of I always give 2 cheers for the climate negotiations. Not 3, not a hearty 3, but 2 cheers. Because it is the global forum where these things are happening. It absolutely opens its doors to international civil society and transnational movements. It's, they're launching a new dialogue this year in Dubai on a global just transition. It's always been a national or regional debate. I'm part of some initiatives that are trying to work with developing countries that are fossil fuel dependent to see how that might work. We have no global framework. There is so much presence there. There is so many people who are definitely see themselves as transnational geopolitan citizens of the world. It's a huge, huge jamboree. I've been to 6 of these events personally, observed them and participated in them. And that's only a minute proportion of the world, but they're from all over the world and they represent most of the world. So it is a microcosm of the world in that sense. So, I mean, to be at Paris when that agreement was gavelled through, I'm too young, it was like Woodstock. Everyone was hugging everyone and crying. It was like those of us who'd been following this for so long never thought this thing would get over the line. So there is a huge effort. And many of the bureaucrats in UN organisations working in and around this area are passionate about these matters. So there is an absolute push there. I mean, you might call them technocrats, but if you meet them, they're people that are incredibly motivated. And of course, the fossil fuel industry is there too, doing its bit. It's an absolute jamboree. Everyone's there. And it's you know, all the world's a stage, and this is the stage. This is the stage where it's unfolding. It's not doing a lot, but it's a massive jamboree of critical conversations and new ideas, and occasionally they leak through and they start to appear in Conference of the Party decisions. Like only 2 years ago we got the first time that the parties mentioned fossil fuels. After 3 decades, it was like Voldemort, the unmentionable. Now we're starting to look at phasing down, not phasing out, phasing down, and now we're looking at a dialogue on just transition. These are really exciting opportunities that have to be seized. So I'm not being Pollyanna, but I just can't see where else these conversations could happen, where this kind of movement can start to percolate around the world.
Sounds like it has a democratic spirit.
There is indeed, yeah.
Democratic in form. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
First of all, lovely lecture. It was phenomenal. And learning a little bit more about policies at a regional level, there has been a lot of debate with policies such as the Green New Deal, where there's claims of a just transition, although there are some signs of this climate emergency concerns that you've been mentioning. So I was wondering, at an international level, what are some strategies we can employ to increase transparency with corporations, as well as maintaining accountability between these corporations and governments on regional level?
Well, one is the rise of what has been called scorecard diplomacy. Diplomacy is a bit odd because it's not actually practiced by diplomats, it's practiced by think tanks and movements. Obviously the German Watch's Climate Change Performance Index is really important, but there's a transparency watch. There's a watch and these are amazing. They have huge influence on the reputation of corporations. And so hit a corporation where it hurts most, its brand name and its reputation would be my first advice. Yeah, first bit of advice. There's more that can be done, but start a new scorecard movement on whatever it is that gripes you. Make it methodologically really sound and do it annually. And then you heap praise and blame on those who perform well and badly. At the COPs themselves, every year, every day and every week, they provide, it's the Fossil Fuel Award. And they have, it's like the Olympics, the first, second and third, and NGOs masquerade as particular countries. And then they introduce the Ray of the Day to a country that's done the best thing in the negotiations that day. Most of the delegates, or many of them, come out of the negotiations to watch the performance. It's usually mid-afternoon each day during the 2-week negotiations. And they go in and laugh and joke about it. It becomes talk of the town. And they often have comedians running it. And it's where comedy is actually really working politically. There are some countries that can't be shamed. We know that. Russia's a fine example. But many can, and they don't like getting these gongs. Australia's got like Fossil Award of the conference far more times than I care to mention. And it actually does cut and embarrasses and, makes some countries rather contrite.
Yeah, it seems like in the environmental movement, the idea of shaming is controversial. So it's interesting to see that works in that context, at least in certain cases.
But also praising, it's both, yeah.
Right, giving people
yeah.
the curious and mystics, yes. I think we have time for one more question, and then we will declare an evening. Yes?
I know Kim Stanley Robinson was an earlier speaker in this series, and he has an excellent book, Ministry for the Future, which talks a lot about like democratic and financialization systems used towards climate change. I was wondering if you have any works of fiction that are presenting like a vision for a truly alternative system in some way that are, I don't know, you felt evocative, meaningful, believable, anything like that.
Both recommendations, the perfect way to end.
Yes, well, I mean, Ministry of the Future, there's a lot of great ideas in there. I found the opening chapter the most profound. That just blew me away. The love story was a bit corny, I have to say. But the financialization idea was quite creative. But, I mean, I've read some climate fiction, but I don't think I've read enough to be able to answer your question. Sometimes they say that didactic fiction doesn't work. Sometimes the story has to be something else, and what you really want them to take home is what's happening in the background, and it shapes the drama that's in the foreground, and it takes away the didactic quality of climate fiction, which was a bit there in Ministry of the Future. But very creative nonetheless. I think that way, and certainly with I think probably television series might even be more, get a wider reach here, and there have been quite a few. I particularly liked Occupied, I don't know if you know that one, the Norwegian Green government that was invaded by Russia and forced to turn the gas back on. I'd recommend that one because it tapped into all the tensions in the Norwegian resistance movement, because those that were appeasing the Russians to stop bloodshed and going back on their promises, the Green government, and then there was those that were resisting. It just highlighted the painful nature of some of the decisions one has to make in this really tricky politics. So I can't answer your question or recommend this is the climate fiction book you should read, but I'd urge you to write it, to write it yourself. But I think maybe that the television drama might reach more audiences. Again, as long as it's not too didactic, I think that's the thing we really have to annoy. People hate being lectured, which I've done at great length tonight, so I apologise.
Well, that's the perfect call to action for Los Angeles, to write a do some television writing. Well, let's thank Professor Eckersley again for making this long trip and sharing the brilliant insight with us tonight.